In 1960, America went to the polls once more. After 8 years of liking Ike, America had now seen the Cold War through 2 different administrations. Massive upheavals were underway in America, and the way that politics had to be played was changing along with it. The 1960 election would be the first held with 50 states in the Union and the first to hold televised presidential debates. And there was also the question of the struggle with ideology and with the Soviet Union. Americans would need to ask themselves if Eisenhower's approach towards Moscow and America was what they wanted. I'm your host David, and this week we are looking at the 1960 US presidential election. This is the Cold War. We aren't sure if the fact that one candidate had a full head of hair and the other's hairline was receding played a role in the 1960 US elections. But if it did, the sponsor of this video, Keeps, might be the difference between winning and losing an election. Statistically, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of hair loss or male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. It's happened to many of my friends, and although it's too late for them, it's not too late for you. Keeps allows you to get treated at home, and thanks to Keeps, you can avoid an awkward visit to the doctor, and your hair loss medication can be delivered right to you. Keeps offers generic versions of 2 FDA-approved hair loss products. You will be surprised by the price. Remember, prevention is the key in these matters. Keeps treatments typically take between 4 and 6 months to see results, so it's important to act fast. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors. Hundreds and thousands of men trust Keeps for their hair loss prevention medication. If you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/thecoldwar or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. That's keeps.com/thecoldwar. So, let's begin with the actual process that the 2 parties use in the United States to choose their presidential candidates. This is a bit of a simplified look, mind you, but as the system can be rather arcane to someone who isn't familiar with it, it's important to get an overview. Now, each party holds a convention every election year where delegates from each state convene to decide on whose names will be on the ticket. To decide which candidates each state will vote for, the party hosts a series of primaries and caucuses in each state. Primaries are like party-wide elections where anybody eligible to vote can cast a ballot for the person they want to win. And caucuses? Well, they're a little weirder. Essentially, a caucus is where eligible party voters from a designated area get together and vote for the person they want to send to vote for them in an election on who should represent the party. Caucuses are an older form of representation and have largely been replaced by primaries in the United States, but some areas still use the caucus method. Because the presiding president over the 1960 election was the Republican Dwight David Eisenhower, let's first examine the GOP, their Republican nomination process. In 1951, Congress had ratified the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, barring any president from serving for more than 2 terms. I suppose the 4-term presidency of FDR had been just a little too much for everyone. So, since Eisenhower was no longer eligible to run, Ike's spot was filled by his vice president, and honestly a man Eisenhower didn't like much, Richard Milhouse Nixon. However, he seemed to have some competition for the nomination. The liberal wing of the Republican Party, which is something I don't feel we get to say very often, wanted to challenge the more conservative Nixon with their candidate, noted Phil Hartman lookalike Nelson Rockefeller. This contest was short-lived, however, as early polling showed little support for him. The rest of the contest, right up to the convention, was more or less unopposed. There was a small protest vote from the party's far-right candidate, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, but it came nowhere close to challenging Nixon's takeover of the party. Okay, so we have Nixon for the grand old party. But what was going on over in Democrat land? Well, the primary season there was a much more fractured race as the Democratic Party tensed over its disparate wings. As many as 7 men ran for the position, including California's Pat Brown, Missouri's Stuart Symington, Texas's Lyndon Baines Johnson, Illinois' Adlai Stevenson, Oregon's Wayne Morse, and finally Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey. Some pretty notable names in the hallowed halls of US politics and global affairs. Oh, and who could forget the little-known Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, JFK, John F. Kennedy. Now, all of these candidates represented the regional differences of the Democratic Party, being a party of Catholics and immigrants in the North, and a party of rural white supremacists in the South. As well, the New Deal and the legacy of FDR still loomed large over the party's reputation as one of the ordinary working man. JFK emerged early as a popular option, but people weren't so sure he'd be a good candidate. First and foremost, Kennedy was a Catholic, and in 1960, there had never been a Catholic president. He was also pretty young for a presidential candidate at only 43 years old. If elected, he would become the first president born in the 20th century. While this seemed to get young voters excited about their first election, many elders in the party worried that young meant inexperienced. Some conceded that he might be a good vice president, but that he was not ready for the Oval Office quite yet. Despite all this baggage, Kennedy's well-funded campaign and powerful television presence endeared him to the primary voters. He ran one of the first genuinely modern campaigns, well-organized, focused on getting out the vote, and energetic. Kennedy, along with his wife Jacqueline and his brother and sisters, went to town to find votes. In comparison, many of his competitors didn't even bother campaigning, as it wasn't really expected at the time. Worries of his Catholicism weighing down the campaign fizzled away with a surprise success in the heavily Protestant West Virginia primary. Rather than an inexperienced Catholic, voters saw a fresh face to bring life into the party after 8 years of Eisenhower. He was a heavy favorite to claim the presidential nomination going into the Democratic National Convention, though he was still short of an outright majority. This meant that there would need to be jockeying and coaxing in the convention's smoke-filled rooms to take the nomination. Despite some last-minute challenges and a televised debate against challenger and influential Senate leader Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy managed to take the nomination. To shore up his weak flank, he was not so popular with the Southern Democrats after all, he named Johnson as his running mate. Kennedy was going to need every edge he could get because, as he looked at the polls, they were tight. This electoral race for either candidate was going to be very close. So, what was Kennedy's plan? How were the Democrats going to get back into the White House? Well, their main approach was to double down on the Cold War. Eisenhower had overseen what was arguably the high watermark of Soviet strength in its competition with the United States. Despite their strength, the Soviet Union was still economically weaker than the US. This fact was true for the entirety of the Cold War, but, and there's always a but, there was a strong perception in the West that the USSR was winning the Cold War in 1960. Kennedy claimed that the Republicans under Eisenhower had let America fall behind the Soviets in space technology. The USSR had already beaten the US to the first satellite and the first person in space, and Kennedy wanted to double down on space investment. He also managed to make an issue out of a perceived missile gap, arguing that the Soviets had a more enormous nuclear stockpile than the US, as well as the means to deliver it. This was not based in fact, and the missile gap was merely an illusion of the most histrionic estimates of Soviet capability. But, perception being the reality, it solidified Kennedy's reputation as a cold warrior, ready to go toe-to-toe with the Soviets, while the Republicans had blinked. But what was the other side doing? Well, as you might anticipate, Nixon's campaign was to emphasize that Kennedy was ill-experienced for such an important job, and that he, as Eisenhower's vice president, was a much more qualified candidate. He promised a presidency focused on avoiding war and embracing a booming economy, largely an extension of Eisenhower's policies in that regard, actually. By contrast, Kennedy called for a change and even embraced his youth as an asset, a fresh new way of looking at the issues. Nonetheless, Kennedy's campaign kept stalling because of his Catholicism. There was an actual fear that since Catholics follow the word of the Pope, that a Catholic president would start taking orders from Rome and America would become a puppet of the Vatican as a result. This belief persisted no matter how often Kennedy assured people that his private spirituality and his public policy were two different things. And while this might seem like a quaint prejudice of the mid-20th century, Kennedy was the first and only Catholic president until the election of Joe Biden in 2020, 6 decades later. Kennedy tried to differentiate himself from Nixon as a supporter of the growing civil rights movement. During the presidential campaign, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested during a sit-in, and Kennedy made this a campaign issue, calling for Dr. King's pardon. Nixon chose to avoid the subject, and this, plus a concerted effort by the Kennedy campaign, grew support for JFK and the Democrats in the ever more powerful and organized civil rights movement, as well as the Black community overall. Now, for many, if you've heard about the 1960 election, it was probably for its famous debates. They were actually the first presidential debates and were the first broadcast on TV. Social scientists have spilled gallons of ink discussing these 4 debates, which ran from September 26th to October 21st. In campaigns held before the debates were introduced, events, newspaper articles, and the radio were how people absorbed presidential campaigns. Now, there was television. You could see the debaters, the candidates, talking to each other live from your living room. Suddenly, attributes like charisma, good looks, and confidence became critically important. Kennedy oozed charm and enthusiasm and was a pretty good-looking guy. To be fair, despite his reputation today, Nixon was a reasonably charismatic person as well, but on the date of the first debate, he was recovering from an infected knee injury he received while on the campaign trail. He had been hospitalized and only recently released, and looked pale, underweight, and had a 5 o'clock shadow. 1960 was an era where beards were not yet considered cool and were strictly the purview of lumberjacks and beatniks. The story goes that people who watched the debate on television reported that Kennedy had won, while those who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon the victor. This story seems most likely apocryphal, but it makes a good point about the changing landscape of American politics. Essentially, a politician must be a savvy backroom dealer as well as a charismatic television figure. The debates seem to have given Kennedy the edge he needed. November 8th, Election Day, rolled along, and late in the night, Kennedy was declared the victor by a healthy 303 to 219 Electoral College victory, but held a mere 0.17% lead in the popular vote, the closest of the 20th century up to that point. Notably, 2 deep Democratic strongholds, Alabama and Mississippi, pledged their Electoral College votes for Senator Harry Byrd to protest Kennedy's defense of desegregation. It was an early sign of the fundamental and seismic shift that the fight over segregation was going to have on the old Confederacy Party in the South. Despite this, Kennedy walked away as the next president of the United States. Kennedy would have a massive impact on Cold War dynamics. He would be the president required to try and deal with Castro's Cuba and with standoffs and walls in Berlin. His aggressive attitude towards the USSR and the mujik with the missiles would result in some of the most heated moments of the whole conflict, including a few fateful days where the entire world held their breath. He would begin a long and costly war, putting containment policy to its test, a test that ultimately failed, but one he didn't live long enough to see. Even his death left its impact on America, be it a televised assassination or one of the most persistent and wide-ranging sets of conspiracy theories in existence. JFK's death was a turning point in both American and in Cold War history. But Kennedy, his stories, and his legacies will have to wait for future videos. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button of your own free will and choice, and not because the Pope told you to. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.